And now, God, open my mouth so that I can speak. Open our ears so that we can hear, and open our hearts so that we can change by your power and through your grace. Amen. Please be seated. When you heard this gospel passage this morning, I wonder if, like me, any of you thought to yourself, really, again? Jesus continues his journey to Jerusalem, and now as he leaves Jericho with his friends and followers, there's a blind beggar on the side of the road calling out to him, and it happens again. Those around Jesus try to shut this man up and stop him from causing a stir. I mean, now it's literally like no one is listening to him. He's been talking to them consistently, well, actually, sort of nonstop, about caring for the least and the lowly. And here's a perfect opportunity for them to show him they've been listening, and they blow right past it again. Now, we have to be careful with this passage because it's a healing story. So we naturally get caught up in the healing part. Many of us in our soundbite society will hear this passage and be quick to reduce it down to an exchange like this. Hey, Jesus, what do you want, friend? I want to see. Okay, because you believe in me, I'll make that happen. Story over, message received. Just believe hard enough and you'll get what you want. At best, this trivializes our faith down to something transactional. I believe in you, and you do what I want. At worst, it sets us up for conflict with Jesus and our faith when those who believe don't get what we want when we want it, which can leave us questioning if our faith in Jesus has been misplaced, and even more heartbreaking, if all of this even matters. Yet there's so much more than the healing of Bartimaeus in this story, and I think we need to explore it. But let's talk about Bartimaeus. We don't really know much of anything about him. What we do know is that he's a blind beggar. We don't really know the circumstances of his blindness, but since he asks to see again, and we're told that he regained his sight, it's safe to assume that he was not born blind. And while we don't know much about his backstory, we can infer some very specific things about him according to the culture of the day. For sure, he was an outcast. Remember that this exchange happens as Jesus is leaving Jericho. He's literally sitting outside of the established community. He's blind, which in first century Jericho meant that he is prohibited from participating in the life of the community. He can't work, so he can't provide for a family. He has no people, no place. He's alone on the ground, with only a cloak as his only possession. No one has any use for him. They likely interpreted his blindness as a punishment from God, which, for the record, it isn't. And it's safe to say that most people don't even see him. Have you ever noticed our ability to look right past the things that make us uncomfortable or remind us of the fragility of life? How many times do we look right past the "will work for food" sign at the foot of the off-ramp? Not only do we look past what makes us uncomfortable, we also try to keep it quiet or make it go away. I remember visiting a church while I was still living in New York City. After the service began, while the preacher was preaching, a woman walked into the sanctuary. To this day, I remember her dignified stride as she walked up the aisle. She had tied a beautiful scarf over her head, which I interpreted as a sign of respect for the fact that she had just entered a church. I can still see it. It was a beautiful, deep purple with gold trim on it, and I remember how regal it made her look. However, the rest of her clothing and the bags she carried made it pretty clear that she was living on the street. She walked up the side aisle of the church and took a seat in a pew. Just as she sat, I noticed two of the men who had just greeted me so pleasantly a few minutes before, when I had arrived, had walked down the aisle too. One sat across the aisle near her, and one sat in the pew behind her. It was obvious what was going on. I couldn't take my eyes off of it. It wasn't lost on her either. She could feel the eyes of those two men on her, and probably a lot of other eyes on her too. Finally, while the sermon was still going on, she turned to one of the men and audibly said, "Did I do something wrong?" The man attempted to quiet her down, but she only repeated her question louder. The preacher's response to this was to speak louder as well, to try to reclaim the attention he was losing. By now, this woman got the message loud and clear that her presence had disturbed the peace. And with that, I think was likely a mix of hurt feelings and anger as she got up, grabbed her bags, and just before she walked out, shouted, "You people need to think about what you're doing here." And she left. The preacher never missed a beat. And most everyone just turned their attention back to the sermon and went on, grateful that the distraction was over. I wish that I could stand here today and say that I had some meaningful response to that moment that made me less complicit and more compassionate, but I can't. I sat there. I watched it play out, and I did nothing about it. I don't know why she came into the church that day. Maybe she was seeking Jesus. Maybe she was seeking shelter and warmth for a while. Maybe she just was hoping for a cup of coffee. I don't know. What I recognize now is that we were all so busy worshiping Jesus that we failed to recognize when he literally walked right into the room. That's kind of what's happening with this crowd today in our gospel passage. They're so busy literally trying to follow Jesus that they fail to follow his example and teaching by trying to silence the voice of one of the very ones that Jesus is calling them to care for. Of course, Bartimaeus is undeterred and responds to those who would silence him by shouting louder until Jesus hears him. And it's when Jesus hears him that everything begins to change. Jesus tells those around him to bring the man to him, and quick as a flash, they go from trying to avoid and silence this man to telling him to take heart. Talk about turning on a dime. I have to admit that I felt a little whiplash from the speed with which this crowd changes its tune. 2 seconds ago, they were all, "Who told this guy he could speak?" And now that Jesus has indicated his interest, they're all on board. I think it's pretty masterful how Jesus could have very easily walked over to the man himself. But instead, he co-opts the members of the crowd into supporting the same person they were trying to overlook just moments before. I often wonder what would have happened if that preacher that day would have asked the ushers to leave Jesus with the purple scarf alone. Or better yet, if he would have left the pulpit and gone to her and told her how very welcome she was. You see, in the end, while I'm confident that Jesus had compassion for Bartimaeus' plight, I don't think his agenda was really about opening Bartimaeus' eyes, but really the eyes of those around him through his healing of Bartimaeus. Think about it. Last week, James and John tell Jesus they want him to do whatever they ask him, and their ask is for glory and privilege. Now Jesus stands in front of a blind beggar who seeks not glory, but mercy. To be restored to the community, to be able to function in the culture he was a part of. He didn't seek notoriety or wealth or power. Jesus has compassion on this and responds with action. That's what we're supposed to pay attention to here. Rather than considering only that Bartimaeus was rewarded for his faith by getting the exact thing he asked for so that we can focus on our own wants, Jesus implores us to hear the calls of mercy that come from those who are marginalized and vulnerable and respond with action that leads to change and restoration for those who find themselves on the outside of the inside. Today, I ask you to consider who is on the outside of the inside. You may find, when you do this, examples both here within our established St. Stephen's community, and surely an abundance of examples beyond these walls, which is why, as I stated in my stewardship letter to you a couple of weeks ago, the vestry and I have identified engagement as our watchword for the coming year. Friends, there is so much tension in the air as the election approaches. No matter which candidates are elected, the challenges facing us today will not evaporate as soon as the results are in. It will be up to us to remain engaged with each other after the election is over, because the real hope of the future lies in us staying connected even when we don't agree on everything, because what binds us in this place is stronger than anything that divides us. It will be up to us to remain engaged with the world outside of this place. While it is always my hope that St. Stephen's serves as a refuge for those who need a place to feel safe and loved from a world that does not always protect them and love them, we cannot exist exclusively as a refuge that we come to solely to escape. We must actually see what's in front of us and respond to it. Whether that's the unhoused in our midst, the plight of desperate immigrants, the killing of innocent Palestinians, anti-Semitism, racism, or any number of phobias that plague our common life today. Being church is not simply about coming to worship. I say this because in a little while you're going to hear someone talk to you about the value of our spiritual journeys here. And friends, make no mistake, there is value in that. But being church is about doing the work of Jesus in the world today. Being a Christian is about work. To follow Jesus is to do the work of mercy, compassion, and love. There can be no question about that. Fun fact: Bartimaeus is the only person that Jesus healed that actually joined him and followed him after. I pray that we hear Jesus' call to us today and that we will take a lesson from Bartimaeus and never allow ourselves to be so busy worshiping Jesus that we forget to follow him.